Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm and festive welcome to our second episode in the transformation podcast that we're in the process of launching, attached to our Business Transformation Europe event. I've made a promise to Milan that by the time we get to episode 3, we will actually have an official name for the podcast. But in true corporate fashion, we've really taken our time to decide what that name should be. But we've got some great ideas. This is a very festive episode because we're recording it a mere 3 days before Christmas. In fact, this is my final business engagement of the year, and I think the same for my two colleagues here, more or less. So it might not be Christmas by the time you get to see this, but it is almost Christmas for us. So that will explain the cheeriness that you'll undoubtedly witness through this episode. Just a reminder for everybody of the concept. We launched this podcast a few months back. Milan was our very first guest. And the idea that we have for going forward is that the person who is interviewed in one episode becomes the co-host, joins me as the co-host for the second episode. A couple of reasons for that. The first reason is that everybody I interview knows a lot more than I do. And the second reason is simply variety. Milan, is very sportingly agreed not only to be the first interviewee, but now the first co-host, brings a certain transformation expertise, but also a sartorial elegance to the pod. So I'm very pleased to have him with me today. Milan, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Ben, for having me, and welcome, Kanak, as well.
Thank you.
Well, Kanak, we're excited to co-host this together. It's going to be Milan in the driving seat. But before we get started and we talk about the topic for today's episode, why don't you just give us a little bit of context on you and your role at Swiss Re?
So, hi everybody. This is so exciting. When I was thinking about this podcast, I thought of it as just a conversation with two friends because that's how this feels to me by now. So my name's Kanak Tripathi. I have been living, breathing, running transformations for the last 2 decades nearly, across a range of topics driven by, and we'll talk about that today, different sparks as we call them. So whether they were to drive new business models, to drive growth and expansion and geographies and other markets, technology as a big driver, but also some other efficiency drivers, for example. So it really across a range of topics. And mainly in the financial services industry, but not only. I'm based in Zurich. I live here with my husband and our almost 2-year-old puppy, Neela. And I'm, as I said, really excited to see where this journey takes us today.
Thank you, Kanak. Well, we've got to be careful because when Milan and I recorded the first episode, we said we'd take half an hour and we took an hour, and that was without talking about dogs, which is my favorite topic. So we've got to be very, very careful which avenues we dive down today. So, topic of today's episode, you mentioned the word spark, Kanak, and that was the inspiration for the title. So the episode today is finding the spark, and I guess the theme of it really is momentum, right? We've been in a number of conversations over the past 6 to 12 months as a group. Most recently, Kanak, you joined us in the CTRO boardroom that we ran with BCG in October in Amsterdam. We talked about momentum a lot. We talked about the fact that it's all very well coming up with a really bold vision, but continuously driving, fueling the flames, fanning the fire, whichever analogy we want to torture for the sake of this podcast, whatever the language you choose, it can be really challenging to keep that transformation going with a high level of momentum. So the subtitle for today is Defining Transformations That Stick. I, like both of you, am obsessed with telling a good story in a series of chapters. So the idea is that each episode of this podcast is effectively a chapter in a book. So Milan, you very kindly and wisely agreed to explain to our listeners what the connection is between the episode you and I recorded last time and this week's festive episode. So perhaps I could ask you to do that to get us started.
Of course, Ben, it was really a pleasure to be the first and to have a conversation that ran over into an hour. And I'm pretty convinced and confident that we could have continued for a bit longer as well. And so with that in mind as well, the first discussion that we had was very much focused around the foundations. So the foundational part of transformation, we touched on the topic of ESG and how ESG should really be woven into the fabric of a company's overall business strategy on the one hand, and of course the operations to bring it to life. At the same time, that's setting the foundations in place, but it's important to make sure, and this is what we'll be discussing in this episode, that whilst we have these foundations embedded into the company, how might we, or how do we ensure that the meaning of transformation, the goals, the vision, the mission stick? And what's really important here is that all employees in the organization feel, and so I use the word feel intentionally because it's an emotion, empowered towards driving the company's purpose forward as well. So really excited for this episode, and then I'll hand back over to you.
That was, as usual, so erudite that I might just make you the permanent host of the podcast. I think that might be kinder to everybody involved. We're going to transition now. Milan, you are in the hot seat. You're the host leading this discussion. So over to you, and let's ask Kanak some very tough, searching, Christmassy questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. And welcome once again, Kanak. The first question, when I was thinking about the foundational part and the definition of transformation, because of course there's a broad Oxford dictionary. I'm UK based, so I have to refer to a local, well-branded university. There are others. Define transformation as a certain statement, and of course there's a company relevance there as well. So in your role as Chief Transformation Officer, what approach did you take to defining what, and I've put in brackets here, maybe digital transformation as one of the pillars, but primarily transformation really meant to you, yourself, and as the company? And the second part of the question is, how did you then communicate your transformation initiatives? Because we have loads of different key initiatives, strategic, operational drivers, so that the employees in the company can also understand the business value throughout the company from a top-down and bottom-up approach as well. So that's really the first question, is understanding the approach that you took. And secondly, how did you communicate that approach to the employees?
Thank you, Milan. I am in the hot seat. I feel a bit warm now, but thank you. It's a great question to start with. I'm going to use some analogies today, so pardon me if they seem a bit too much, but that's how I simplify things for myself anyway. So not just the current role that I'm in, Milan, which is really the Chief Transformation Officer for building and taking a new business to market in a company that's 160 plus years old, and so that comes with its own set of challenges. In that context, really, digital was not an enabler. So it wasn't, here's ChatGPT enterprise version to help you write your contracts better, but it was really taking a new technology product out to market. And being an insurance company, it's as, worlds apart as it can get. So in our context, really, Milan, at the beginning, it was very important, I think, for me, genuinely, to ask myself, back to your word, Ben, what is the purpose of this, right? What is it that we're trying to solve for, right? So we have a huge number of options and technology at our disposal, but at the end of the day, what we want is for our clients to be able to understand their insurance portfolios better. We want them to have as real-time information as they can get about hazards and the claims that they're about to pay and the number of the amount of reserves they hold. How can they prepare themselves better? So it goes back to that question, as Ben said, it's to what is the purpose? What is it that you're trying to solve for? And the analogy that I often, think of when I think of technology and, with the question of AI is, it's like driving a car. You're not going to give the keys of your car to a technology, to an AI, or to somebody you don't know. But what you can have technology, AI, do for you is be your co-pilot, is be your navigator, right? So you're still in the lead and you're allowing technology to help you, but the journey is still yours, the destination is still yours, why you're going there is still yours. It's just you have somebody who can help you navigate that journey better. So going back to your question, Milan, how did we communicate that? I think the first thing was really transparency, and transparency two ways, not one way, right? So we started with a listening tour, I remember, with my CEO. That was our first, I think, a month and a half, is just sitting with people, who've been in this business, sitting together with clients and really just listening. And we call them unfiltered. And it was really a safe space where we, these conversations were not recorded. Chatham Hold's rules applied. So whatever was said in the room, unless explicitly said, stayed in the room. And I think that helped to build a real sense of safety with the leadership, which was the CEO and me, very early on in the process, right? So we learned about what do clients really want or don't want? What are they willing to pay for or not, right? What do you think about our products? Do you think they're competitive, and so on? So I think that two-way transparency at the beginning was absolutely critical. And once we had all of this input, then I think what people heard back was not somebody giving them the best written story. What they got back was a reflection of what they have told us and where they have told us we should go. So I think that's why it wasn't so much of an effort, and it landed, and it landed well.
I like your analogy there, Kanak, especially around the car. And it made me think about driverless cars. Who's really in control? And are we being used as humans through technology? Because it's really the technology that's driving there. And it's the world of Uberization, I suppose, is also coming very, very fast at us. The second point you made around two ways, I think it's also quite an important point, because often in my experience, we've also seen this top-down heavy approach. And what we might say is a bottom-up approach as well. So it's transactional. At the same time, it's focused. And what clients want is something that stands out everywhere. What clients don't want is something that doesn't come up so often. Yes. So it's interesting to see that you also took into account what clients do not want.
And it was actually based on some really painful experiences. So it wasn't like a profound aha moment after meditating for 20 hours in a cave, Milan. It was really, it was very easy to understand what clients didn't want because they weren't willing to pay for it. And I think it goes back to, being honest with yourself and not, I think, pushing for someone something or someone just because it used to be a good idea at one point in time. The other thing, maybe last point to your question, Milan, is the ability to pivot, especially in a transformation that's driven by taking a new product to market or driving growth by experimenting, right? It's so important to pivot, and you will not be able to pivot if you are if you sort of lead transformations more traditionally or more hierarchically, right? You want an environment which is dynamic, where conversations are happening real time and you get that impulse, and then you can change and adapt as you go. And that's so important as well.
And the words you're using here it takes me back to innovation days, where experimenting, what problems you're trying to solve for. And I really like what you said around what are we trying to solve for? Because otherwise we try to use these, or companies may try to use the word transformation for the sake of knowing that it's the right thing or a good thing to do. Really kind of peeling the onion, as we were, to understand where are we getting towards, to what initial problems are we trying to solve. And I guess an additional question to that as well is not focusing only on products, I suppose. It's also the operations, people transformation. Digital is one of them as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. So when I think of transformations, and Ben and I talked about that a lot at the boardroom, which was fantastic, Ben, because what I really appreciated the boardroom brought was, again, there were, I don't know, 20 or 25 different companies from different sectors trying to run transformations of all different kinds and driven by very different triggers, right? So there's Philip Morris, who's trying to completely change who they are and what they bring to the market. So that's a very different driver. Or you have a huge logistics company who in the next 10 years wants to be among the top three that, in the space that they're competing in, right? And how they're thinking about it. For me, that was so rich, because that tells me that, yes, there can be all these different drivers across different industries, but the challenges, and Milan, you will know and appreciate this, are very fundamental, as you said, and common, right? So at the end of the day, and this goes back to thinking about transformations or changes holistically, and those who are familiar with the word systemically, right? So you're thinking about, again, what's the purpose? What am I trying to solve for? What am I trying to build? So that's your sort of vision. How am I going to get there, right? So the strategy, who are my clients? What do they need? How many different clients, different types of clients do I have? How am I going to serve them? You think about what I call the building blocks, right? Which is your operations, which is your technology platforms, which is about decision structures and governance structures. Then the third layer is the capabilities, right? And I don't mean skills. And it's very easy to sort of say, okay, you need a bunch of technical skills. So for example, in our case, it was, okay, now we need to have SaaS sales skills, right? Or we need to have product management skills, which are very different traditionally to what Swiss Re had in terms of skill sets. So yes, there are these technical skill sets, but there's also how do you now engage with a different kind of a client? You were talking to insurance buyers before, and now you're talking to chief technology officers at the same client before. So how does your language need to change? How does your sense of urgency need to change, right? You don't have 5 underwriters sitting in the headquarters, sort of who can give you the answer. You're there, you're present, you're competing with people who are not insurers, you're competing with the tech, sort of giants of the world. So how do you equip yourself to make decisions on the spot, right? So again, these are things that you really need to think about at the beginning, the capabilities you need. And then how do you create a learning organization? For me, that was my biggest learning from this, Milan, is how do I build a learning organization that has the safety, the capacity as well, and the systems needed to help them build and practice these skills. And by learning organization, I also mean, if something is not working as planned or is failing, right? How quickly can we learn from that and move forward without pointing fingers and blaming? I'm not saying that didn't happen, but at least the endeavor was that changes. And finally, the fourth one is really the culture, right? And culture can be such an abstract word, you will appreciate that, Ben and Milan, right? It's not fluffy, and yes, it is that as well, right? But it's really, how do you make decisions when when the going gets tough? How do you incentivize the right behaviors, right? So how do you encourage teamwork? How do you make decisions as a leadership team? What kind of leaders do you want in the organization? Do you want people who are who are driven by a sense of team? Do you want people who are very strong individual contributors? And both have their place, right? But what is it that you want to build? So for me, those 4 pillars are sort of how I think about transformations holistically, and how I go in about designing and then executing them as well.
Fabulous.
So if we, as I said before we pressed record, my role in this is going to be to clarify and to keep us, because I know you two we can go on a tremendous tangent and talk about all kinds of things. We want to keep it tied to that core theme, right? So the first point of clarity is that initial element around retaining momentum for any transformation that you do. For you, Kanak starts first. The first thing that you said was thinking about what the client of that whoever that client is, whether internal or external, it's about thinking what that client wants from their transformation. And by what they want, you seem to be thinking about that on quite a deep level, right? We're talking about their real purpose for the organization. So I guess the one question I have off the back of that is, what happens to chief transformation officers or to transformation leaders if they don't agree with the purpose that the client, that internal client is bringing forward, right? Because I've sat in a room with lots of you, and you all have very bold ideas for what the purpose or the why of an organization should be. What happens when you're in an environment where you don't totally believe that internal client has the right purpose? And I'm not necessarily asking you to speak to your present organization here, but just in general terms, can you give any advice on that point? Because it feels kind of important if we're going to build that momentum that is the subject of this episode.
So in true fashion, Ben, I will give a very honest perspective for me as a person, and that's shaped by a number of life experiences that may be different for different people. And then maybe maybe a bit more of a, of an organization's perspective, right? So for me, as the Chief Transformation Officer, I am motivated when I can create something and I can build something and I can see things through and I'm accountable. That's really important to me. Mm-hmm. And I think that's also what, if I were the CEO of a firm, I would want from a Chief Transformation Officer, the ability to shape, to drive things independently, and also to be super honest, right, about where we are versus where we should be. If that wasn't available to me as a setting, I think I would be deeply misaligned with that transformation. So I think my sincere urge to all of us is in the community is to genuinely, at the beginning of a role, or at the possibility of a role like this, ask yourselves how truly and fully aligned do you feel with the transformation that you're about to set on. Because you will both agree, I'm sure Milan will, right? It takes a lot out of you if you do it well, right? You are genuinely invested, and if you don't watch out, you're going to run on empty pretty soon if you're not aligned. So I think, again, it has to be mutually aligning and rewarding. From an organization's perspective, then again, it happens, right? I mean, you step into a role and something changes. Maybe the macro environment changes, right? Or the board has different expectations, or the budget's gone away for whatever reason, right? So there are many external changes that you cannot influence. I think, to the point, you have to ask yourself, and I think your job as a chief transformation officer is also to keep your the CEO, the CFOs, and the key decision makers and stakeholders in the organization informed. That's your key role as a chief transformation officer, to provide transparency. And I think in that process, it's a collective decision to be made. Are we still keeping to what we originally wanted to do? And if not, then is that a conscious decision? Then it's fine. And then you also communicate that conscious decisions and the reason behind it to your organization. But what happens, and I'm sure Milan will agree, is we all, and it's no judgment, I think we all just get busy. So you just produce the same reports every quarter in the hope that something's magically going to change, because nobody has the courage to voice it, right? And then I think the longer you keep it that way, the consequences just get, more and more painful for everybody. So my advice to everybody is just be honest with yourself. And if things change along the way, then be honest with yourself and with the people that are, in key decision making roles.
So in other words, if we're thinking about long-term momentum for a project, there's actually got to be quite an early stage decision made by the Chief Transformation Officer or that change leader about what the organizational purpose is and how well they align with it. So we're actually talking about the momentum being something that's built at core, and it's not just about the job, it's about the individual personally being aligned, because as you've said, it's so emotionally draining, or emotionally, there's a huge emotional requirement in order to do the role of a transformation leader so well. Yeah. Interesting. Okay, Milan, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. There were a couple of points as well that came to mind, kind of as you were speaking, the cultural aspect that we've seen. So, currently, if you're located in Switzerland, there's a certain type of culture, behavior, attitudes. Yeah. Whereas if I look at it from my perspective, also in a role which has an element of a global aspect, our mothership is in Japan. So there's the different cultural nuances, and respecting the fact that we are different and there are more things in common as well is one aspect. The other point around transformation that we're also beginning to look into, and I'd be interested in hearing your views here, are the intergenerational approaches. So Gen X, Y, Z, Alpha that are now coming into the workplace, because the stickiness and how you provide the stickiness also differs in terms of how you engage with different generations. So interested to hear your view on this as well.
That's a great question, Milan. Yeah, I think I'm very tempted to go on all sorts of tangents, but I'm looking at Ben. So I'll tackle the generational one first because it's quite real to me. So in my current team, I have all of those generations that you've just talked about, Milan, right? And that it is a transformation team. So by definition, your job isn't well defined, right? You sort of, it's a very dynamic role that, that requires a huge amount of sense of agency and emotional maturity and the courage to have difficult conversations and so on and so forth, right? What I find in my experience, Milan, is, and I also have neurodivergent people on the same team, right? So, and with the feedback that I get from the team is the reason that they all feel A, safe, and B, that they are performing really well is because there's no one who's trying to change them, have them all conform to a mold. And the second thing that they appreciate is that they all have an equally strong voice. So the opinion of somebody who's just joined the team out of university is just as valid as somebody who's been, in the team or in the firm for 35 years.
Yeah.
And I guess when I went into this role and I had the privilege of building this team, I think very, very selfishly, Milan, I wanted as many different perspectives and representations of the organization into my team. So I wanted the Gen Z member of my team to represent the Gen Z generation of Swiss Re and tell me, how do they think about change? What do they need? There are people, and back to passport cultures, Milan, again, I've had the privilege of having global roles, right? So to a person in the US, the language is very different. How you talk to them is different because they're relatively less hierarchical than some other, maybe Asian cultures. Like India is close to both of us, I think, for good example, where maybe somebody, for whatever reason, needs more safety or more reinforcement than other cultures perhaps. And I won't say they're less independent. I think they're just a different construct. Or other cultures that are very hierarchical and not out of lack of capability but just out of respect, are always looking at the boss, oh, am I now allowed to speak? Am I, can I share my opinion? I think the worst thing you can do is to create a fake sense of commonality and force it. I think there will be things in common, which is the firm, what it tries to do, your customers, what they want. But then I think the difference is what makes a business rich, both in terms of commercially rich, but also culturally rich. And that's what attracts the best talent as well. I mean, this is what Swiss Re is known for, right? It's people and the diversity and the culture, and it's such a rich bed for the best talent in the world to perform. I don't know if that answers your question, Milan.
It fully does. In fact, so my takeaway from your answer here, Kanak, is very much this human-centric drive of transformation, not a tech drive towards transformation, which sometimes happens. That someone somewhere will have read an article about how amazing the next AI, which is evolving so rapidly, it's difficult to keep a pace with it. This is what we need to implement by next month. Whereas what you're speaking about is this human centricity first. Yeah.
A great example that comes to mind is the head of a certain department was trying to convince his huge team about why they should start using or adopting ChatGPT in their work, right? And I was running a workshop with them on a leadership topic, and he said that, and then there was just stunned silence, right? And it goes back again to it's a hierarchical, culture. Not many people speak up, etc. And again, as a chief transformation officer, I think your other role is you are the voice of the teams, right? When they may not have a voice. And then I sort of ended up saying, I'm sure that this team feels unsafe so the question is very obvious: will this come and take away our jobs, right? And so
Mhm.
he sort of picked up on that question, which was fabulous, and he said, absolutely, no, that's not my intention. So I'm very glad you asked me this question, and we can get that out of the way. And I loved then how he positioned it, and he said, what I want is for you, which is a bunch of lawyers who are some of the most critical thinkers and a bit cynical by nature of their job, not cynical as people, but just by means of what they do. So if you can test this, and you can test it for hallucinations, and you can test it and build the model and train it so that it becomes usable to others, for me that's value, right? And as soon as he said it, you could see, like, shoulders dropped, and people sort of, I think, started A, feeling safe, and B, then started thinking of possibilities. Because you can only start thinking about innovation and possibilities, you'll know this, Milan, from your role in innovation, when they feel safe, right? When they are standing on solid ground, and that's so important with technology.
So can I maybe pick up on one or two pieces there, Kanak, if that's okay with you, Milan? Because you talk, this concept of emotional safety is really interesting, right? Because one of the big challenges for you as change leaders is not everybody is as comfortable with uncertainty and high levels of change and disruption as you are, because if you weren't, you wouldn't be doing the job that you're doing. And I've had a number of those types of conversations with you, and I'm always quite stunned by how relaxed you are about how uncertain things could be. And I'm trying to get there, but believe me, it's a slow burn. But this point about emotional safety, I want to ask you about that, because to the sort of the lay person, there's a kind of obvious contradiction, right? Like, how do you create, because I guess what I mean by that is, how do you create that sense of emotional safety and also drive that comfort with lots of change? Because it does seem quite difficult to get those things to marry up and to go together well. Does that make sense? And I guess that that links into this broader topic of bottom-up transformation, right? Because at least in the business cultures that we're generally operating in day to day, one of the ways that you create emotional safety for people is to make them feel that they have a stake in the game, right? Everybody has a stake in the game of change or transformation. But the problem with that, right, is that historically there's a sense that part of what makes transformation good is that there's a sort of simple unifying purpose that everybody can buy into, because otherwise it gets too complicated. So there's a lot of questions in that. But to me, like, the idea of emotional safety seems awesome, but how are you as a transformation leader squaring that with needing to push people to change and to be a bit uncomfortable? Because I think that ties into the topic of making that transformation stick. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I'd love Milan's perspective on it as well. But I'll give it a go, and then, Milan, I'd love to hear you as well. I'll talk about my own journey as a parallel bend. So when I started doing these sort of roles, right, I am generally a person who loves harmony and wants to create an environment that's good for people, and I was very driven by that. So the first few years of my life as a transformation leader, it was very painful for me to see that wasn't the case. And I think it was it was a bit naive. I was young, and in time I realized something very fundamental. How people feel, I cannot control. But what I can control is, how am I bringing them along on the journey? And then what shifted in me subtly, though, Ben, was that I stopped trying to make people feel better, because that was not in my control. And I think it also would get into this odd sort of parent-child equation, which I think is a theme that most organizations should explore, because even the best sort of leaders, CEOs, CFOs, etc., CTOs trying to drive transformations don't share openly or are not transparent openly for two reasons. I think the more, I'm going to say something controversial now. I think there is this one school of thought, which is maybe a bit traditional, where people need to know what they just need to know, the bare minimum, right? You don't need to give them all this context. It's not important, because what they care about is how does this affect me and my job. And I think that's such a narrow way of looking at really well informed, intelligent, capable human beings, right? And what that does is, when people take that tone to their teams, they completely diminish people, right? So they take away agency, they take away trust, and they take away any sort of hope for positive contribution right back from the team. And the equation is very much, I'm going to tell you this is how you do your job, and then you just go do your job, right? And then there is, I think, a more evolving sort of style of leadership, which I think they initially struggle with. I don't want to make people uncomfortable. I don't want them to worry about things that they don't need to worry about. They're both unhealthy, right? Because you are not treating others as adults who are capable of managing their own emotions. So my approach changed then to, I will give people as much information as I possibly can. And I think that sort of became my signature as a chief transformation officer, is this really raw honesty and transparency, right? I mean, other than breaking laws, I think I've been very, very transparent with people. And what that does, Ben, is two things. It gives people the agency to decide whether or not they want to come along on the journey, and more often than not people do. And secondly, you get ideas from the people who know your business the best, right? So the chance of succeeding at your transformation, or the chances are quite high, as opposed to this very top down approach of transformations.
Understood. Thank you for taking that one on, because I'm hugely aware that I've said my role was to keep us from tangents, and I'm just as tempted as you are to drive one. But I just think that's a really interesting topic, because there's such a human element to this, which I think, Milan, is a topic you were going to ask about and cover as well. We're trying to keep this bite size, as we said. We've got time, probably, Milan, for one more kind of meaty question for Kanak, and then we're going to try and take a couple of minutes to pull it together into a few key takeaways, and we'll do some quick fire questions at the end as well, Kanak, which you haven't been prepared for, because you're a chief transformation officer and you think on your feet, right? That's how it goes.
I'll do my best.
Yeah, Milan, as they say, back to you in the studio.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Ben. And just to add as well, kind of from my view here, in terms of what you said, I really like the balanced, ambidextrous approach that you refer to. In addition to that, the approach that I've taken is around two aspects. Let's say gravitas is one, and then the creation of momentum for change. And what I mean by momentum here is, as you, in your role, a chief transformation officer, it can be quite a lonely world.
Yes.
Because you're surrounded by lots of CXOs, your employees, but really it's your mission, your purpose, your drive. And then you realize that there are many other, quote, lonely people within the company who are driving their own purpose and change, as change agents, let's say. Yeah. So the not just the philosophy, the approach I've taken is this kind of the lonesome world to more united, which means that there are other people that are trying to solve the same kind of problems, maybe not at the same level. And once you identify who they are, they become your fans or your supporters and your ambassadors. And before you know it, it's this ripple effect that they become your spokespeople to then disseminate information from a people-to-people point of view. And then, yes, you have formal communications on top as well. The gravitas part, and we're running very quickly out of time here, was a lesson learned in my last job around 15 years ago, actually maybe around 20 years ago now even, which was we had an idea in the team. We approached a chief X officer, a very senior executive in the company. And he said, what are you asking? So we'd love to work in your team and for you to be our sponsor. I said, I'm already a shining star. And he didn't mean it in a glowy way of in an egoistic way at all. So people know who I am. I'm in a senior position already. So by me absorbing you in my team, no one else will notice you. What I suggest is I become your sponsor and you stay independent, but attach my name to you. So it's this analogy of stars in space and galaxy. We're a tiny little spectacle against a shining star.
Yeah.
He joined, so his name became part of ours. So before we knew it, more and more people started to join us.
Yeah.
And so we started glowing a bit more in this space. That attracted more people to asking questions. Who are you and what's your mission, purpose? And that was another thing that worked really, as an approach, worked really well. Which leads me nicely onto the last topic, is around approaches and frameworks, tools and techniques, because you mentioned at the beginning kind of problems we're trying to solve. And of course, there are different tools and methods and techniques that CTOs in your role are also using. So what might be your recommended tools or methods that are maybe your favorite that you refer to, of course, dependent upon the type of problems that you're trying to solve?
My first one, as I alluded to before as well, it's by Jay Goliath. It's the STAR framework for change or transformations. I'm sure you're familiar with it as well, right? Is again to look at these four or five elements that make any transformation or the way that you look at them complete, right? Is what is your vision and strategy? What are the building blocks of infrastructure, governance, operating models? The third one being people and skills. The fourth one is around talent management. So it's a bit different. And then really around the culture and the behaviors that you build. And I, since then I've added a few more to it. I think technology becomes one on its own because it's such a huge driver. So that's one. The other one is design thinking. It's one of my favorites. I'm sure it's everybody's. But you can do so much with it. You can do so much with it with clients as well, right? And I highly recommend that people do that in the beginning. The third one is really very simple. We used to call them scorecards, right? And everybody has a different way of doing that, but really keeping them simple. So it's not so much of a framework as much as a keep it simple. The only, for example, metric that we measured was our P&L. And that was what people took accountability for. And, there were pros and cons, but what it did is it helped people keep focused on the thing that mattered the most in the next 2 to 3 years. So keep your scoreboards simple and make sure that they convey an obvious, transparent picture and the same picture to everybody, right? So you're sharing the same scoreboard with your executive team as you are with the rest of your teams.
Kanak, thank you so much. Time has absolutely flown, as we had imagined at the beginning as well. And there's a lot of ground that we've covered here as well, from, of course, the communication, the definition of transformation as a leader, to then communicating and getting your buy-in from stakeholders, the community, the employees, how your human-centric approach is really integral to the way that you, as the Chief Transformation Officer, has and have led transformations in your company, and of course the tools and methods. I'm also a fan of design thinking massively as well. So thank you very, very much for being open, transparent, and honest there as well. And with that, Ben, I'd like to hand back over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kanak. So as you know, you will be the one in Milan's seat next time. So you'll be the guest host. And I think you've set us up perfectly for a number of other conversations. But the thing that really resonates with me, having sat in the first episode, the next one, looking at the links between them, is we talked about designing for stickiness. And I think I was thinking of the design and the purpose of transformation and its implementation as two separate things. And actually, the takeaway that I have is you're saying really the opposite, right? Which is there has to be that initial alignment if you are to have just the emotional energy to go and drive transformation. And then I love that conversation around emotional safety and how we reconcile that with the need to push for change. I think that gives us so much food for thought. So our topic was designing for stickiness. I think it was a very sticky session because we could have carried on for 2 hours more. To close, we go with 2 quick fire questions. Milan had to run this gauntlet last time. So the first, Kanak, is favorite book and why in 10 seconds or less?
So it's coaching with heart and mind, or I'll get the name wrong, but it's by an author called Mary Beth O'Neill, and she talks about it's a coaching book, but it I think is equally applicable to chief transformations officers, and it's really using both your spine, as in your courage, and your heart, right, to be able to coach and to take people through change. So I absolutely love that book and would recommend. When I'll get the title and right,
Nice.
but I'll
Okay.
share it.
And question 2, final question is favorite film and why?
Favorite film. It's gonna sound very bizarre, but I recently like binge watched Beverly Hills Cop, the whole series. Don't ask me why. It's
was
just,
not expecting that from you at all.
I know. I'm just in that sort of the other ones, Back to the Future, all of them. So yeah.
Fantastic. Well, we are coming into the right season to be watching Back to the Future. Beverly Hills Cop was a surprise, but you learn something new every day. Look, both of you, we really appreciate the time. Wish you, of course, both a very happy Christmas, although that will seem strange to people watching this podcast, but it's been a fantastic year and we really appreciate your support of the community. So thank you very much. And those of you listening and watching, we look forward to bringing you the next episode in the coming weeks where Milan will get a break, but Kanak will be back with us as co-host. So thank you very much. And for today, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good Christmas. Thank you.